What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode on the channel. Today, we're going to be going over our college football rankings for week 10. Obviously, we saw a lot go on last week, a few teams rising up, a few teams falling off. And with that being said, we're just going to dive straight into it. At the 25th spot for me this week, I have Oklahoma State. A lot of teams within that bottom-ish area, but Oklahoma State has been solid this year. Right now, they're in second place for the Big 12, right behind Oklahoma. There's a four-way tie between them, Iowa State, Texas, and Oklahoma. So Oklahoma State, I feel like one of the best teams right now overall within the Big 12. Obviously, Texas and Oklahoma still very good. But besides that, this Oklahoma State team could definitely make a push depending on what we see from the rest of the division just because of their conference play this year. But they've played well, and within this 25-ish area, there's definitely a few different teams you could throw in there. I was impressed by their win over Kansas earlier this year, also a win over Kansas State as well. And between those two teams, I know a lot of people, including the AP, put Kansas State in there at 25. Oklahoma State beat them. They also beat Kansas, who was ranked at the time. I just feel like that is warranting a spot on my list.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Oklahoma State is right outside my list. At 25, I have a very familiar face with USC. USC almost choked against Cal, so they still look rough to me. Caleb Williams had 370 yards and two touchdowns. Let's not pretend like the problem with this USC team has ever been Caleb Williams. He is still one of the best players in college football, at least one of the best quarterbacks, but we both know this. It's just not a Pac-12 caliber defense. They could get killed by pretty much anyone else left on their roster just because you never know what you're going to see from that secondary. And we've mostly seen bad things, if we can be honest. They're coming back home. They're going back to the Coliseum to match up against Washington. And if I can be honest with you, things might get ugly. With Roma Duns and Michael Penix Jr. at the helm, this Washington team could really absolutely go nuts against their secondary. I expect a big performance from Washington, but as for now, USC still hangs around at the back of my rankings at 25.
Yeah, and I have USC coming in here at 24, coming back into the rankings just because there was a lot of teams that kind of fell off, including UNC. I don't think they should be ranked, especially after the loss this week. They've just been completely going downhill. USC, like you said, going up against Washington this week. I do think Washington's going to put a lot of points up, but from what we know from USC, I mean, the over-under set at 76 right now, I feel like that's pretty low. This could easily be another 50 to 49 game like we've seen. Both of these offenses are very good. And this is one of those games where Washington, clearly the better team, but if USC can go out there with Caleb Williams and he can perform, they can easily keep it close. The spread's at 3.5 right now. I think that, I mean, that's pretty realistic. I know this USC team has had some struggles in the past few weeks, but they're going to be able to put up points. I don't think they're going to be able to get a stop against Washington, but it is going to be a close game. And USC, definitely a massive game for them, a massive game for Washington as well. Both of these guys, I think Caleb Williams outside of that Heisman contention right now, just because of the play the past few weeks. But if he goes in there and somehow dominates this Washington team, he could throw his name back in there. But Michael Penix as well, talking about Washington a little bit later, they're still one of the best teams in the country. So I expect this to be a very good offensive battle, though.
Yeah, absolutely. It's bound to be high scoring. 24, here's where I have Kansas. I mean, just what a win at home in a Big 12 rivalry game. I don't think a lot of us expected Kansas to come out on top of this one, especially considering Oklahoma has been rising up the boards. I mean, we've seen it week to week. They seem to have been flying up. They're hanging around a lot of people's top four. Not us personally, but you get the idea. Bean for Kansas stepped up at quarterback, and Neal handled the backfield a majority of the snaps, and that's what brought them to a huge upset. I mean, they just have a dynamic offense, and we saw it. I mean, I feel like Oklahoma's defense has been pretty solid this year, but Kansas exposed their weak spots. And Dylan Gabriel, we'll talk about later when we talk more about Oklahoma. I mean, this is back-to-back weeks where he's faltered in must-win games. He got on top of it with UCF, against his former team. That was a good win at the end of the day, but he did not look like the Heisman candidate that we said he was these last couple weeks against the Jayhawks. Kansas gets a really big win. It's going to be huge for their season. They've been ranked and then fallen off the boards. They're back here for me. And in a Big 12 that still has some question marks, they could end out on top of it.
Yeah. Next, another team for me at the 23rd spot, James Madison here, coming off of a win last week against Old Dominion. They're going to go up against Georgia State in Georgia State this week. So a tough matchup for them. Georgia State's been solid this year, 6-2 up to this point. And on the road, this is definitely a big game for them. They don't have very many tough matchups for the rest of the year, but this is definitely going to be one for them. If they can come out with this win, I mean, the season, the rest of the year, they should be able to cruise through it. Teams like Coastal Carolina, their last game of the season, that will probably be tough. Coastal Carolina has definitely played solid this year, but they're going to go up against teams like Appalachian State. They should win that game. UConn, they should win that game. So this Georgia State game, very big if they want to continue to keep winning out and potentially go undefeated. A very tough matchup for them this week. So definitely a underrated game to look out for.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. 23, I have a team that a lot of people don't have in their top 25s. I have Fresno State. They were 22 last week. They catch a win. They move down a spot. That's kind of the shakeup for these lower level teams in my 20s. But Mikey Keene put up 4 touchdowns at home. They're 7-1 now. They have a very good record, and they've beat some pretty solid teams. But for now, you look at the rest of their schedule, I really expect the Bulldogs to win out. It sounds like a hot take, but when you look at the teams they got to match up against, I'm not really seeing anyone that's going to give them much of a struggle. I think their hardest game left is against San Jose State. That's a pretty solid team that they have over there. But I think Fresno State outclasses every one of their opponents at the end of their schedule. If this is the team that ends the season with only 1 loss, I think it might be early to the punch here because I think they're going to make a lot of people's top 25s. Do they deserve it yet? I guess that's up to you. But for me, I've liked what I've seen enough from Keene and the rest of this Bulldogs team. I think they're deserving of being a ranked squad at this point.
Yeah, another team coming back into the rankings now too. Kansas, you talked about a little bit before. They went up against Oklahoma, got a huge win. I had them ranked last time during week 7 at the 24 spot. Then they kind of fell off a little bit, but back in the rankings here at 22. Obviously, a massive victory for a team that I had in the 5th spot last week, Oklahoma, with Dylan Gabriel, who was pushing for a Heisman Trophy this year. I still think Oklahoma will be fine. We can talk about them a little bit later. But this Kansas team, a massive win. They are going to go up against Iowa State this week. Iowa State at home, Iowa State, the 2.5-point favorite. So another very good game to watch out for this week between those two teams. If Kansas can come away with a win, that would be massive for them. This is another game that, even though Iowa State's not ranked, definitely a good win for them in the Big 12. Kansas, their 2 losses this year both happened in the Big 12. So it would be tough. They could potentially still push for that Big 12 championship. There's a lot of teams in the race right now, but with all these teams kind of being wishy-washy throughout the past few weeks, if Kansas can come away with a win, that would be huge. But on the other end, if Iowa State comes out of this with a win against a ranked Kansas, they're 5-1 in the Big 12. They still can definitely make some noise for the rest of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Another huge game. At 22, I have Tennessee. Finally, I'm putting them back on my rankings. My favorite team had unranked for the last couple weeks, but they bounced back and get a good win against Kentucky, who had been ranked a couple weeks in the past. And I was really impressed with Joe Milton. Joe Milton, I mean, in college football, the storyline usually revolves around a team's quarterback. And Joe Milton had pretty high expectations this year. And honestly, he hadn't reached them. We saw what he could do on this last drive of the game. He leads Tennessee to beat Kentucky, a pretty bitter rival at this point, both teams being somewhat equally as competitive, and Tennessee comes out on top of it. I mean, it's very impressive. Usually, the biggest struggle for the Volunteers is when they're in close games. If the opposing quarterback plays well, they can't win. It doesn't matter the other factors. They get out of it. They play out of their heads when the opposing quarterback has a good game. We saw it last year when they were still ranked for a playoff spot and they lost to South Carolina on the back of a great game from Spencer Rattler. We saw a great game from Devin Leary. I want to give Devin Leary credit. He's been incredible all year. I'd say he's really one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC, if not all of college football. And he had a great game against the Volunteers, and Tennessee still came out on top because of individual great performances on offense. This is not something we've seen all year. We did not see it against Florida. We did not see it against Alabama when Mertz and Milroe both had really great outings. But even with Leary playing at his best, Tennessee wins. That's enough for me to be convinced to put them back into the top 25. Obviously, I have some bias there, but I've been lower on them than most just because I don't think they've reached their ceiling. And if they continue to play strong towards the end of the year, I don't really care what the win-loss record looks like. It's definitely encouraging as a fan of the team because we're finally seeing some of these guys that have been playing below expectations hit their potential. So I'm happy to have them here. Hopefully they can start moving up with some easier games coming up in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, Tennessee definitely turning it around. UCLA here at 21, an interesting team to look at. They're going up against Arizona this week, which Arizona coming into this game, this will be their 5th ranked game in a row. Starting off their stretch, they lost to Washington by 7. They lost to USC by 2, but then they go out and they beat Washington State by almost 40. They beat Oregon State, and now they're going up against ranked UCLA. If they come out with this win in the Pac-12, which is very competitive right now, I mean, this Arizona team has to be ranked if they go out there and beat Washington State, Oregon State, and UCLA, 3 wins in a row. Then they're going to go up against Colorado next week and then Utah the week after. This is a very tough schedule. And for a team with 3 losses where the combined points between these losses right now is 16 against Washington, USC, which was good at the time, and Mississippi State, who was pretty good at the beginning of the season. They've fallen off a little bit, but this team is a very good team overall. UCLA going to be in for a tough matchup. It just depends on what we see from the quarterback play. Coming out this whole season, it's been on and off. And overall, Dante Moore has been good, but there's been times where he's been very bad too. So we'll see what we get from there. Either way, though, on the opposite end, like I said, if Arizona comes out of this with a win, they could be right back in it in the Pac-12. This is a Pac-12 where we've seen a lot of shakeup. So a very big game to look out for in one of the weeks where we may not have these massive ranked against ranked matchups. There is definitely some, but there's going to be a lot of close games with some lower level ranked matchups and unranked teams.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. If there's ever going to be a 3-loss team in my top 25, it would be a team like Arizona. But talking about a team that has no losses up until this point, I have James Madison decently high at 21. I talked about McLeod last week, and he turned the ball over a couple times, but JMU stays undefeated. A win is a win. I'm always going to have respect for a team that's 8-0, especially at this point of the season, with some pretty fraudulent teams towards the bottom. I know people will argue and say that a Tennessee team or a USC team would beat James Madison, but you have to respect a team that's doing everything that they can do. I mean, it's the unfortunate truth that some teams that play in weaker conferences aren't going to get the respect from the AP poll, but I'll give them as much respect as I can. James Madison has looked solid. They've been stuck in some close games, as a lot of, mid-major teams find themselves doing, especially towards the middle of the season where there's injuries and guys are fatigued. But James Madison's come out on top of it. They faced adversity and they faced it with wins. I like them a lot. I'm going to give them respect. And until they show me a very poor performance or they catch a loss, they're going to be in my top 25. And I'm pretty confident that if they win out, they have to be towards the middle of the pack, if not the top.
Yeah, another team within that same area, Tulane in the American right now. They're in first. They're 7-1. Their only loss that they had before was to Ole Miss earlier in the season, which they had the lead for a little while. Since then, they have been rattling off wins. And like I said last week, going up against Rice, it would definitely be a tough matchup. They end up coming out with a win. They win by 2. JT Daniels went out there and he threw for 2 touchdowns. He had a pick too, but Michael Pratt went out there and played well. They ran the ball very well, almost 200 rushing yards from the team overall, and a very impressive win for them. Like I said before, Rice, a competitive team this year with JT Daniels, a guy that could start at a lot of the major 5 schools at this point, went out there going to Rice, a little different outlook for him this year. But overall, they had a very good win this week against Rice, who's 4-4, but they've been competitive. And if they can continue to go out there and get wins, another team like JMU, like we talked about before, where they can go out there and probably land within the middle of the pack if they win out. They're going up against East Carolina this week. They should win that by a lot. Michael Pratt going to have another big game.
Yeah. And at 20, here's where I have Oregon State. It's a pretty big drop off if you watched this last week. I have them bumping down 8 spots, but they just lost to a team that is inferior. At least it should be. Maybe not up till this point. I'll do my weekly Damian Martinez update. I love to do it. He was all right. He got like 80 yards, but their defense just let up way too much on the other side. I mean, Fafita McMillan connected 8 times for 80 yards and a touchdown. That's great offense. And it's going up against this Oregon State defense that I've had troubles with in the past. I mean, even against some of the better teams that they've had to match up against, they've let up way too much in the passing game, and it finally bit them in the ankles here. They dropped pretty far from my list, and I still think they have potential. As we mentioned, the Pac-12, there's a lot going on out there. There's teams that could go on big runs towards the end of the season, and it will tell the story of their entire year. But Oregon State, I'm worried, is not one of them. We saw them drop a game that they should not have lost, and they're going to take the toll in my rankings as they fall down 8 spots, the biggest faller out of anyone on my list.
Yeah, and like you talked about before, I have Tennessee here at 19, coming off of a big win against Kentucky. Kentucky, a very competitive team this year throughout the first 5 weeks. Since then, losing to Georgia, Mizzou, and Tennessee the past few weeks. So definitely falling off, but a good competitive win for Tennessee this week. They move up for me above some of these teams like Tulane, UCLA, Kansas, within the same area. I just think Tennessee is a better team. They have a very good offense this year. The one struggle that has appeared for them, as we've seen, that red zone offense, they just haven't been able to get the ball into the end zone. Right now, they have pretty close to some of the most amount of yards per week overall, especially within the SEC, which is a very good offensive and just overall, as we know how good the SEC can be. But they just haven't been able to put the ball in the end zone. When we're looking at them, comparing to them to other teams within this top area with yards per game, comparing them to Oklahoma, Oregon, LSU, all those teams have 40, close to 50 touchdowns. And if we look at Tennessee, only 28 offensive touchdowns this year with close to 450 yards. It just doesn't really match up in the end. That's the one main reason why they just haven't been able to break past some of these standards that were set for them last year. Though they've had some good games, especially this week against Kentucky. They're still a solid squad. I think they're definitely still, like you've said, they have some easier games towards the end of this season. They're playing UConn this week. They should blow that team out of the water. If there's a week to go up there and add 10 touchdowns to your total, this is one of those weeks. I still think they can end up having a pretty solid season. Obviously, they're going to have to go up against Mizzou and Georgia towards the end of the year, but this is going to be a massive game for them if they go out there and figure it out against UConn. That Missouri game, a very big game for them. Probably maybe top 15 or 20 matchup for both of those teams. Then we'll see exactly what happens with the shakeup. But for now, I have Tennessee at the 19. They've been impressive for me the past few weeks.
Yeah, that's a very fair ranking. At 19, I have Utah dropping down 6 spots. I mean, this was a game where Oregon was favored, don't get me wrong, but it was supposed to be pretty competitive, and they were just completely outclassed. Their defense couldn't handle Bo Nix. That secondary especially has shown problems, all year, at least in the last couple of weeks, and they were just absolutely dominated by Oregon. We talk about Utah, the quarterback situation, with Cam Rising officially not being available for the rest of the year. I expected that to maybe alleviate some of the stress off Bryson Barnes and maybe allow him to have a good game going into Oregon, and that's just not what we saw. He's been playing above expectations, so I'll give him credit there, but it seems like he fell back to earth in a very competitive game, and he just had a terrible performance. I mean, 2 interceptions. Watching it could have been 3 or 4. He just didn't look like a great quarterback. Hypothetically, if this Utah team has Rising for the whole year, based on some of the past performances we've seen, maybe they're a top 10 team in the country. You could say that, but that's just not the world we live in. And Oregon has shown this entire year that they're one of the best teams in college football. We'll talk about them later. And Utah is just not on the same playing field. It should have been more competitive. It's obviously a rivalry Pac-12 matchup, but Oregon comes out on top, and Utah has to suffer, dropping down pretty favorably in this list.
Yeah, and I have them at 18 here, also dropping down 6 spots. They just didn't come out to play this week. Oregon, obviously the better team, but like you said, I expected it to be at least a little more competitive. And this Utah team, as we know, without their starting quarterback, they just haven't really been able to do much, especially last week. They're going to go up against Arizona State this week. And honestly, I don't think they're going to be ranked by the end of the year. After that, at Washington, at Arizona versus Colorado. They could honestly lose all three of those games. I know Colorado isn't ranked right now, but we know how good Shedeur Sanders and that offense is. And Utah just can't really do anything offensively at this point. Like we just talked about too, Arizona, a very tough matchup, especially playing there. I don't see them even being within close to Washington if they play the way they played against Oregon. So this team with some high expectations going into the year. They played very well through the first few weeks. We saw them kind of how we expected to see what would happen without their starting quarterback against Oregon. It seemed like they kind of moved through some of those weeks earlier, trying to figure out different ways to get in the end zone. But just an embarrassing loss. And this Utah team is definitely going downhill. I don't really see much potential for them for the rest of the year, especially with that schedule.
Hey, and we have some harsh takes, so Utah fans, let us know what we're wrong about. But at 18, I have UCLA. This game, it's a matchup against an unranked Colorado team, a Colorado team that we've seen play more like their projections recently, even though we both know they've already surpassed all the expectations they had. With that being said, it's a sold out game, packed in Los Angeles. All the stars are out, and UCLA comes out on top. This would have been a big statement game for Colorado, and they just didn't let that happen. Shedeur Sanders, I mean, don't get me wrong, he had a great game, but he didn't dominate in the way that we've seen Shedeur Sanders do in the past. And that's nothing against him, but it is credit to the UCLA defense, especially their run defense. I've mentioned it in the past. They don't let anything fly in the run game, and it kind of reminds me of what NFL teams do when they go against the 49ers. The 49ers have the best run defense in professional football, and teams know they just shouldn't waste time running against them. It doesn't go anywhere, and that's what we've seen with these Pac-12 teams going up against UCLA. Teams don't even attempt to run against them, even though Colorado's running game really isn't that bad. I think UCLA has allowed that facet of their game to tell the story of their season, and if you're a team with a dominant run defense, that's going to bode well for you going forward down the stretch. When, games we get into worse weather and things get sloppy, you have a good run defense, it's going to work out well for you. I guess my point is I'm impressed with them. They jump up 3 spots in my rankings, a little bit higher than most. They have some really tough games coming up, so we could see them fall out or who knows, rise all the way up. But you beat Colorado, probably one of the better unranked teams in college football right now. Going to give you some respect there. I really liked what I saw from UCLA, especially on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, another team falling down a few spots this week for me. Oregon State at 17 falling down 4 spots, and it seems like I'm just going to keep talking about Arizona every single time. Losing to Arizona, a 3-point loss. Like I said before, Oregon State, a very good team around that top 10 area, but losing to Arizona, a 2-loss team now for Oregon State. They're going to drop down a little bit. They're going to go against Colorado this week. The spread's about 14 right now. So interesting to look at. It's in Colorado. This is one of those games, like you said, we know that Colorado's expectations are a lot higher than they were at the beginning of the season just because of how they started. But I expect this to be a very competitive game. We know how good Shedeur Sanders has been, one of the best college quarterbacks right now, despite that defense not playing very well, which it seems like we've seen a lot of that from the Pac-12, very high-powered offenses with not so great defenses. That's why all these games end up being massive 50-50 games that we see towards the end go into overtime. But this should be a good competitive game. I feel like 13.5 is a bit of a stretch. A Colorado team that could go out there, especially with Oregon State coming off of that loss, both teams coming off of a loss, but it seems like Colorado kind of less expectations than Oregon State at this point. Colorado needs 2 more wins to be bowl eligible. Obviously, that's a massive storyline for them if they can become bowl eligible after being the worst team in college football last year. And this could be definitely a massive game for them overall. I expect a close game. I do think that 14-point spread is kind of big. Oregon State still in the running. As we know, all these Pac-12 teams, they've definitely had some issues like USC already at 2 losses too, which we expected them to be a potential playoff team. So a lot of big games left, and Oregon State still definitely in there, but that loss last week doesn't help them at all.
Yeah, and at 17, I have Tulane all the way up here, higher than most. I have them jumping up a spot from last week, and that Rice game was definitely scary. They win by less than a field goal, only 2 points there. And as you mentioned earlier, JT Daniels played very well for Rice. We expect JT Daniels to have good performances against, some of these non-Power 5 teams because realistically, as you have said, he is a Power 5 quarterback. So He met my expectations there, but on the opposite side, Tulane still gets the win. Shout out to Hughes on the ground, picking up 150 yards. I talk about Michael Pratt a lot, but I think Hughes is a really, really good running back. He could also be a guy that could be a Power 5 player. You can tell by the way he runs the football. He's aggressive and he goes out there. I mean, he just performs every week. So credit to him there. Wouldn't be surprised if he transfers, to be honest with you. But Tulane wins on the road against Rice. I'm going to give them credit there. They bump up a spot. And I think this team is very, very good, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They have some issues. They do have their blocking miscues every once in a while. I mean, we see it. It's a problem that troubles every college football team on offense, especially as we get, as I've mentioned, things get sloppy. There's a lot of injuries that have been coming up. And Tulane has rolled with the punches, only one loss. And I think they're just a really solid team at this point. Going to give them credit where it's due. And they could sneak into the top 15 pretty soon.
Yeah, another team that could sneak into the top 15, I have them at 16 right now, is Air Force. Probably the biggest storyline in college football this year. They've been up there with some of the best teams overall, undefeated up to this point. They go out, they beat Colorado State, and Colorado State hasn't been the best team this year. But with guys like Torrey Horton, overall, this team has just been pretty decent. They've been able to compete. Obviously, they had that massive game against Colorado earlier in the year, one of the most watched games. And for Air Force to have 32 passing yards and still come out and win this game, obviously, they run the ball a lot. Everyone knows that, 260 yards on the ground. And they got it done. They got 30 points up against Colorado State. They're going to go up against Army this week, and they're projected to win. The spread's about 18.5. The over-under's 32. So I think you can figure out how that game's probably going to go. They don't really expect Army to put up that much of a fight. And Air Force, like that we said before, tough matchup against Colorado State. They're going to go out for the rest of this year. They're going to go against Army, Hawaii, Boise State. One game that's going to be interesting to look for is the UNLV game. UNLV, the only team left in college football that's undefeated against the spread. So just something to throw out there right now after last week. Air Force definitely looking to make a push towards that top 15. And depending on how these teams play for the rest of the year, I wouldn't be surprised if they're a top 10 team by the end of the year.
Yeah, and I have Air Force in 16 as well, and I completely agree. This is a team that legitimately could make a top 10 push. People will complain because they play a weird style of offense and you don't like to watch them, and they don't play against opponents that you usually care about. But we're watching good football when we watch the Air Force Falcons. This team is legitimately a threat, and I do think they could beat pretty much every team ranked below them. That's genuinely true. Emmanuel Michel is a monster. He is one of the best backs in college football. I know he gets a lot of touches, so his stats may be inflated, but there's a reason they trust him to get the touches. He's a guy that just runs tough, and he is one of my favorite players to watch in college football. With that being said, they play against Colorado State. We came on here last week. We both thought Air Force would get the win, but we both acknowledge Colorado State is the ultimate trap team. They play very tight with all their opponents, and usually they end up losing, but they definitely put up a fight. I think Air Force is really good. They jump up 3 spots. It seems like they've been jumping higher and higher every week on everyone's rankings. That includes mine, that includes yours. I think Air Force is the team that's going to make a push. And UNLV, I like how they cover the spread. I think that's a great tidbit there. But I really do think Air Force finishes out this season with no losses. I think they're going to be an undefeated team. And even if that's not good enough to make a playoff push, it's definitely good enough to make a New York Six bowl game. So a lot of credit to Air Force. They are doing much better than I expected.
Yeah, and another team doing much better than I think a lot of people expected is Missouri here at 15. Overall, they've been very good this year. The one problem that they're going to run into is Georgia this week at Georgia. Obviously, last week, Georgia out there against Florida in the cocktail party. They won 43-20, a big win for them overall. Carson Beck looked very good, 315 yards and 2 touchdowns. Dajon Edwards, a very good running back, close to 100 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Ladd McConkey, too, another big game for him, 135 yards. He's one of those guys that is climbing up a lot of people's boards. Definitely towards the bottom of the receivers before the season started, but he's definitely developed into Carson Beck's probably his number one guy, especially with Brock Bowers out with an injury. But Mizzou coming into this game, Throughout the history of Georgia and Missouri, it seems like it's always competitive no matter who's ranked. There's been some years where Missouri's been ranked, Georgia hasn't. And obviously, in the past few years, Georgia's been up there as the number one team for pretty much every week. But Missouri going to come in here, hopefully looking for a win. If you are Missouri, the spread's at 15.5. I do think Georgia should be able to come out with this win, but I do think it'll be more competitive than we expect. It'll be a different game than we saw with Kentucky. Like I said during that Kentucky preview, it was just obvious what was going to happen. Kentucky really good at running the ball, Georgia very good at stopping the run. And when it came down to throwing the ball, we just didn't see much from Devin Leary. And this week, though, going up against Mizzou, Mizzou has had a good amount of success throwing the ball. So we'll see what happens. I think it'll be an interesting matchup, but for everyone talking about Georgia, I know there's some people not even having Georgia in the top 4. A big matchup right now with Missouri being a top 15 team right now. So a big win for Georgia if they can get it done and probably put away some of the people that are saying maybe Georgia shouldn't even be in a college playoff spot right now.
That's wild. That's definitely a big prove it game for either sides, both sides of the spectrum. At 15, another team that just came off their prove it game, Louisville, shuts out Duke. If not for this loss against Pitt earlier in the season, they would be a consensus top 10 team in the country. They are really that good. They should be undefeated, but I mean, you can't cry over spilt milk, and Louisville is going to try to still make a push regardless. Jawar Jordan, might be the best running back in college football right now. I know that's a hot take, but I've been talking about some great running backs. It seems like every team I've talked about here, and Jawar Jordan blows them all out of the water. I mean, the ability that he has to put the team on his back and win this game by himself against Duke, who we've seen be a competitive team in college football all year, that absolutely sells it for me. I like Plummer a lot for Louisville. He's had great games in the past. Against Duke, it wasn't really one of them. It was more of a running game. And I do feel really bad for Duke fans because their team was legitimately fighting for a case to be a top 10 team in college football not that long ago. And with Riley Leonard's injury status and obviously a very competitive last couple of games, they've kind of fell out of it. So it is sad not to see Duke here after all the potential we saw from them early in the season. But Louisville just proved they're the better team. It's an ACC matchup. Tensions fly high, and they come out on top of it against a Duke team that had Riley Leonard really healthy or not. I think we both know not much, but Louisville still gets a big win there, and their season relies on Plummer and Jordan just absolutely excelling on offense. If they can click at the same time, I think Louisville goes far. If not, I don't think they can realistically win some of these tougher matchups they have towards the end of their season with Plummer not at his best. So that's something to look out for. But for the moment, jumping up almost 10 spots, absolutely incredible for the Cardinals on my list.
Yeah, and I have them at 14 too, for every reason that you said. My second biggest jumper this week with 5 spots. At the 14 spot, they're going to go up against Virginia Tech this week. Right now, Louisville in second place for the ACC, looking for a big ACC championship game against Florida State towards the end of the year if everything remains the same. But this team has been very solid. Obviously, that Pitt loss definitely hurt them, but they've been able to bounce back against Duke this week, Duke being ranked last week for us. And coming into this game, I was expecting a competitive game. They blew them out 23-0. They're going to go up against Virginia Tech this week, so another big game for them. Virginia Tech right now, kind of within the area of being one of those competitive teams in the ACC, but Louisville should be a lot better. They should go out there and win that game. Miami and Kentucky towards the end of the year, probably going to be very competitive matchups. We've seen Kentucky and Miami both be ranked for us this year. Obviously, they've had some tough stretches recently, but Louisville definitely in the area to finish this season with only 1 loss. And if they really are that good, be within the top 10. And if they can go out there and get an ACC championship and only have 1 loss and they go up against Florida State, we could potentially be talking about the winner of that game getting a playoff spot.
Yeah, and that is incredible for, Florida State as well, but Louisville did not expect him to be in that situation. 14, you mentioned them earlier. Another team that didn't really expect to be in this situation is Missouri. They smoked South Carolina at home. We've said this about a lot of teams now, but I think a lot of them fit the category. South Carolina, not necessarily one of the best teams in college football or anything, but usually pretty competitive in their conference, and that's just not what we saw in this game. Missouri handled business. Cody Charter with 160 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground definitely looked solid. Cook obviously has to have the arm talent and the poise to go into Georgia next week, go into that matchup and succeed. That's definitely more of the storyline, but you don't want to breeze over teams like South Carolina and look ahead at Georgia. I think we see teams fall into that trap all the time. You got a matchup against a team ranked number 1 and you fall off the week before because you're not paying attention. And Missouri impressed me because they didn't do that. Not for a second did they look like they were going to give South Carolina this game. Very impressive. They jump up a couple spots, and I mean, good for them. They're ranking up at 14 against a Georgia team that I have obviously pretty high up there. The AP has them at 1. So it's going to be a huge game. I don't necessarily expect Missouri to win. I don't think that's a hot take, but I really do expect them, as you mentioned as well, to be competitive. I think maybe they cover the spread, but realistically, I mean, it could be a game that comes down to a touchdown. That being said, Georgia's incredibly talented. They could go blow them out of the water, but I really like what the Tigers have been doing this season, and I think Missouri gives Georgia a run for their money at the very least.
Yeah, talking about some other SEC teams, I think the biggest matchup this week, I have LSU here at 13 going up against Alabama, a 3-point spread. This is going to be a very competitive matchup between these two teams, and it's interesting to look at because I feel like this LSU offense a lot better than Alabama, but the Alabama defense is very good too. So it's one of those matchups where we're going to see what happens if that LSU offense can break through that Alabama defense. But on the opposite end, can the LSU defense hold that Alabama offense? This is one of the years in the past few years we haven't really seen a very competitive SEC West. It seems like Alabama's just been able to run through it. Obviously, LSU had that undefeated year, but between these two teams and also Ole Miss, which we'll talk about a little bit later, all three of these teams have probably an even shot to make the playoffs at this point, at least to make the SEC championship. If LSU comes out here and beats Alabama, then it's really between them and Ole Miss. But there's a lot of shakeup that can happen throughout these next few weeks. So we're going to see what happens in that SEC West between these top 3 teams. LSU versus Alabama, a very big matchup, and especially looking at this, like I said before, this LSU offense very good with Jayden Daniels. This is one of those moments where I still think the Heisman race is pretty open. I do think Michael Penix is still the favorite at this point. But if Jayden Daniels can go out there and beat Alabama on this massive stage, he will definitely rise up and probably be up there with Michael Penix for the Heisman.
Yeah, I have LSU at 13 as well. And guys, I'm telling you at home, do not take my advice as gambling advice. If you guys haven't been watching, I'm 1-3 in my big game predictions, but we're about to get the 5th one right here. LSU is going to win this game. Jayden Daniels will cement himself as the second or possibly first player mentioned in the Heisman race. I really think LSU's offense is good enough to match up against this Alabama defense. We've seen it all year. When they're hot, no one in all of college football can stop them. I think that includes Alabama. Give me LSU. It's obviously going to be a great game. I do have Alabama ranked higher, so it's definitely a hot call right there. But I like LSU. I think they go and win it. I've got a lot of flack for riding with Alabama, maybe a little bit too heavy this year. Not anymore. I got LSU.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, I'm pretty surprised to see going against Alabama. I know last time you went with Tennessee over Alabama, so trying to run it back next week.
Yep.
They're going against Kentucky, so I mean, eventually they'll lose one of these games, and hopefully this is the week that we see that. LSU, like I've talked about all season, I'm a fan of them this season overall. They've had a very tough schedule, and for a team that's at 2 losses to be at 13 is amazing at this point. I mean, they could break into the top 10 just because they're so good. They just had those tough matchups earlier in the year. And another team exactly like that, Notre Dame at 12 here. Notre Dame has been very solid outside of those 2 losses. Last week, going up against Pitt, they absolutely destroyed them. Not really a surprise there. And overall, for the rest of this season, I mean, Notre Dame is looking to kind of make their way into the top 10 towards the end of the season. We talked about it a little bit last week. It's kind of the classic Notre Dame spot to go up against a tough team earlier in the season and lose that, but then make their way up, maybe end up in the 7 or the 8 seed. And since they're not in a division, they can't play in a championship game. They're not going to be able to make the playoffs. I mean, it's just being honest here, there's no way that this team makes it into the playoffs just because they're not going to play a championship game. And you're not going to put a 2-loss Notre Dame team in the playoffs over even a 2-loss team that wins a championship game. It just doesn't make sense. But they're still going to be solid. They're going up against Clemson this week, only a 3-point spread at Clemson. So an interesting game to look out for. Definitely a potential trap game for them. Clemson has been decent some weeks, very bad other weeks. So a close game to look at. And if you really like Notre Dame in this matchup, that 3-point spread can be very enticing. But on the opposite end, if you really think that Clemson can go out here and keep it close, very interesting line to look at going into this week.
Yeah, and I hadn't looked at that line. I did not expect it to be so close. At 12, I have Oklahoma, dropping them down 6 spots. I had them at 6 last week. It's just a really tough loss. I really do like Kansas. I think they're a good team, but this should have been a game that Oklahoma handled easily, if we're being honest. I think Walker looked good in the run game, which is something we haven't seen every week, but that's back-to-back tough games for Dillon Gabriel. And I do hold him to a pretty high expectation. I know his numbers really weren't all that bad in this matchup, but I expect him to go out there and do Heisman candidate things if we're going to say that he is one. And at this point, I think he's proven that he's not. I think that's very harsh, and I really do think Dillon Gabriel is a great quarterback, but he needs to go out and win games like this, big rivalry games against Big 12 teams that are inferior. And at this point, he just didn't do it. The UFC game, I was willing to call it a fluke, especially emotions high going against his former team. But dropping a game to Kansas, we've seen great teams drop games to Kansas in past years towards the end of the season. And I guess Oklahoma just falls on that list now. They dropped down 6 spots. Definitely disappointing. I still do think they're talented enough to easily make their way back into the top 10. I think Dillon Gabriel just figures some things out, finds that confidence that brought him into a Heisman candidate spot. I see no problems with the rest of this Oklahoma squad. Just some kinks you got to figure out here. They dropped down to 12, but with that being said, I think they're definitely around a top 10 team in football, very close. So could see them rise up here just this week, not having it down at 12.
Yeah. Like I just talked about before, Ole Miss here, I have at 11. A big fan of this team overall this year. Jackson Dart, one of my favorite players in college football. He came out, they beat Vandy this week, and they're still definitely in that area to make an SEC championship game. They're going up against Texas A&M this week, another tough matchup. We pretty much talked about Texas A&M every week just because they're in these tough SEC matchups. But it's going to be a close game, another 3-point spread where Texas A&M has been good all year. They're 5-3 up to this point, really only losing those games against ranked opponents. And Ole Miss still breaking into that top 10 if they can get a win this week, depending on what we see between teams like LSU and Alabama, some other teams. We can't really predict exactly who's going to lose or fall off just because we've had so many unpredictable losses this year. But Ole Miss knocking on that top 10 area and still in that SEC West, or where they can be competitive. So an interesting team to look out for the rest of the year. Obviously some big matchups towards the end of the year. That only lost to Alabama earlier in the year. They're going to go up against Georgia next week. And then after that, outside of that, Texas A&M, UL Monroe, and Mississippi State, they should be able to win all those games. But that Georgia game going to be very big next week.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. I got Ole Miss at 11 as well. They just absolutely spanked Vanderbilt, which is what good teams are supposed to do in college football, and we've seen it all year from other teams in the SEC. I know you must have been happy to see Quinshon Judkins come alive, get 2 touchdowns. Talent-wise, he should be having one of the most electric seasons in college football. Kind of didn't see it at the start of the year. We're starting to see it now at the perfect time. So I think that's going to be a big storyline for the Rebels going forward. But this team is top 10 caliber, as you mentioned, knocking right out the door at 11. And with some big games coming up, I mean, it's obviously a nice stretch for them to end the season, hopefully 3-0, but they still got some good matchups to watch out for. So who knows? Maybe they could be in that top 10 sooner than later if they find their way on top of those.
Yeah, and talking about sooner than later, we have Oklahoma here at 10, coming off of that big loss to Kansas. And this is one of those interesting moments where they're going to be up there with Texas, but usually, I always like to have the team that beat them above them, but this is one of those rare instances where Texas just has to be ranked higher, in my opinion. I think pretty much everywhere you look, Texas is ranked higher. And losing to Kansas on the road, they were unranked going into this week. Kansas now ranked. I think it just makes more sense to have Texas since it was a very close game. I think if Oklahoma blew them out, it would be very different. But Texas has been very solid throughout this year. And Oklahoma coming off of that loss, and now it makes it even more interesting because we were kind of talking about before in this Big 12 that we could see maybe Texas, a one-loss Texas go up against Oklahoma, who would be undefeated towards the end of the season in that rematch. But now there's a lot of other teams in contention in this Big 12. I mean, Oklahoma State's still up there, Iowa State, because at the end of the day, it's based off the conference play. And overall, we're going to see a lot of these teams play against each other. So an interesting end of the season. Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, all these teams 4-1 up to this point. So it's going to be interesting to see how this end of the season goes. Dillon Gabriel, I know we had question marks about him towards the beginning of the season. He played very well through the start of the season, obviously winning that game against Texas. But now it seems like this potentially could be the real Dillon Gabriel that comes out. We don't really know. And overall, I think this Oklahoma team is still very solid, but they definitely have their back against the wall right now. With another loss, that virtually kind of puts them out of the Big 12 championship area. They should be able to go through some of these games, but Oklahoma State going to be a very tough matchup at Oklahoma State this week. Like I talked about before, a big game to look out for.
Yeah. And at 10, I have a 2-loss team with Notre Dame. I don't think a lot of people have teams with 2 losses hanging around their top 10 at this point in the season. But let's not forget the Fighting Irish have 2 very high quality losses. And when they win, I mean, they win. They just beat Pitt by 50. And I know Pitt is bad, but that's a team that beat up on Louisville, who's hanging around pretty high in our rankings. So there has to be some level of respect there when you beat them by 50. Estime has 3 touchdowns. He looks incredible every week. And we've kind of seen Notre Dame not necessarily give Hartman as much pressure week to week. I don't know if that was a conscious decision or just the matchups they've been in. They've been more comfortable running the ball. Don't really think it's a problem either way, but we're seeing a lot of guys contribute in the run game outside of Estime, despite him definitely being the lead guy. Their defense stepped up. I don't have a ton of notes. I expected them to go out and beat Pitt pretty good, but just seeing the big number 50 or 51 technically is always nice. It's definitely boost them up a little bit. They have big matchups coming up. They have USC. That's definitely going to be a great game. If they can win that, I think consensusly, they're going to get a lot more respect in people's polls. But at the end of the day, you can't really argue with me putting them top 10 with 2 losses. I mean, that's higher than most would, giving them a lot of respect there. And I'm giving them leeway. There's no more Colin big game projections this episode, but I think they should be able to go out there with USC and be competitive, win or lose. I mean, they'll probably hang around the rankings, but I mean, that's definitely the biggest game that they have to have marked up till this point. So really excited to see how that one goes. But for now, giving them a lot of leeway, putting them top 10.
Yeah, and Penn State here at 9 for me. They move up. Kind of an ugly game against Indiana this week. Indiana just went out there. They got some big plays at the start of the game, passing the ball, 3 touchdowns for them in the air. And besides that, they just didn't really look good on the other end. Penn State with a very good defense kind of just let up a lot of big plays. I know the main thing that we've talked about all year is Drew Allard just hasn't been able to get those deep passes. They just haven't run deep plays. And he finally got one this week. He got a deep touchdown. He threw it deep, and Keandre Lambert-Smith went out there, got the touchdown, a massive game for him. And overall, I'm just expecting a little bit more from this team. They're going to go up against Michigan in 2 weeks. They're going up against Maryland this week. They should be able to come out with a win there. It is going to be a tougher matchup, though. We've seen Maryland play pretty solid this year overall. As we know, with Tagovailoa on the opposite end, he's been very good for them. So it should be a closer game than I think a lot would expect. The spread's around 10 points. I think that's pretty fair. Maryland has been good, especially at home, but I expect Penn State to come back and win this game. If they want to go up against Michigan and be competitive, they're going to need a big bounce back game this week. Even though they beat Indiana, they were expected to beat them by a lot more. So expecting a big offensive output this week. I do want to see them kind of get the run game more set up. They do give the running backs opportunities to run the ball. I mean, but they're just not good opportunities. James Franklin's not a good play caller. He runs the ball on 3rd down every time. It clearly doesn't work. And it just ends up being these wide receiver and running back screens pretty much every play. I want to see the playbook open up a little more. Hopefully they can figure it out when they go up against Michigan.
Yeah, this sounds like a lot of the same things I have to say with Tennessee when we're talking about my favorite team. So definitely some correlation there, but I have State at 9, much better team than Tennessee. And I think Drew Lohr had a good game. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, a tough one with Indiana, but they just got to let him throw it deep more. I know everyone says that. I know that might be like a casual opinion, but he was a 5-star QB for a reason. He has an arm. The playbook has to expand, as you mentioned, and allow him to make more plays like that. I think you brought up a lot of great points. I'm not going to add too much fuel to the fire there. Penn State has to go out and beat Maryland. I think they will. And that Michigan matchup tells the tale of both of those teams' seasons. So that's going to be a very highly touted matchup. I mean, whoever wins that decides their fate up till that point. So a lot of pressure there. We're not there yet. So as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be a team that looks ahead in the schedule. You want to be a team that plays week to week. And I think Franklin, although he's had his issues this year, I've been nice to him so far. I'll continue to be a little nice to him, give him some slack. I don't really think he's the type of coach to do that. I think he's going to take this Maryland game seriously. They go out, win by a touchdown or two at the very least, and then take that Michigan game and, hopefully have a big performance and go out and win. Just from a fan perspective, that would be electric. But for now, ranked in the top 10, they're pretty solidified there. They go out and beat Maryland. Really looking forward to the next week for this Penn State team. So some big things to come.
Yeah, and another team with a big game this week, Alabama. Talked about it a little bit earlier with LSU. It should be a good matchup. Jaden Daniels going out there. Malik Neighbor should have another big game too. And LSU, it just seems like this offense a lot better than Alabama's, but Alabama's defense, one of the best in the country. So it should be an electric matchup. We'll see what happens between these two teams. I know you picked LSU to win. I mean, I'll back that too. I hope LSU can come out here and win. Jaden Daniels, I think, clearly the better quarterback. It just depends on what we see from Jalen Milroe. Like I said, that defense is very good. So if Alabama can hold them for a little bit and Jalen Milroe can just do what he needs to do to win, they can come out there and get a win. But hopefully LSU can come out here and get a massive win at Alabama. If it was in LSU, it would be a lot different. But both of these teams, some of the best home field advantage in the country. So a very big matchup to look out for, especially with some playoff and SEC championship implications.
Yeah, and I'll give the opposite side of the coin why my take could be wrong. Let's not pretend like this was an easy decision for me. I definitely bounced back and forth. But I mean, we both know all the big names on this Alabama defense. People will talk about Dallas Turner and Kool-Aid McKinstry, but they just have contributors at every level, and they have the most depth at pretty much any defensive position in all of college football. They have guys when, it's a second down and dudes are gassed. They have a backup that comes in and was a 5-star, 4-year all-state performer. Like, they have dogs on that roster, and they're going to go out there. They're going to be fresh, and we've seen Alabama perform in big moments. I mean, all of these SEC teams have had big games throughout their history, don't get me wrong, but Alabama has been the one in the last couple of decades that has consistently made the most of their opportunities, and this LSU game would definitely be high up on the list because this decides who is a real contender in the SEC at this point. Alabama wants to prove they are. Obviously, a tougher start to the season than they anticipated. A lot of people were ready to write them off. If they win this game, I think they're going to be back, especially in the AP voters and the coaches polls that definitely veer to the pro side of Alabama a lot. They definitely like to give the Crimson Tide credit. If they go out and beat LSU, they're probably going to be in a lot of people's playoffs. To be determined on if that would be my list or not. Have to see how they perform, but they definitely have a lot on the line in this game. They've proven in the past, especially Nick Saban at the head coaching position, has proven that he's willing to go out there and do whatever it takes. They're definitely going to be well prepared for this game. If there's anyone that can shut down Jaden Daniels, it will be Alabama. As I mentioned, I don't think it's anyone, but the Crimson Tide are going to go make a case for it. And based on what we've seen this season, they're going to be Daniel's toughest matchup that he's probably ever had to face in college football. So Alabama, not going to say anything bad about them. I do think they're a really great team, and this matchup is going to be the one to watch. If you're going to watch a game this weekend, make it this one because I really see it as a high-powered matchup.
Yeah, and like you said, overall, if Alabama comes out with this win, as we know, the college football rankings starting this week, so their rankings completely different than the AP, not really any preseason bias or anything. They just go based off what we've seen to start the season. So we'll see what happens with those rankings. If Alabama comes out with a win this week, they could easily be in that top 4 next week. As of right now, kind of the AP completely obsolete at this point, just because the college football playoff rankings are really the only ones that matter from now on. Towards the end of the year, the AP doesn't really decide anything after this. And another team kind of within that area, Oregon at 7, another team that could easily be close to a playoff spot at this point, kind of tough with Washington also being up there, losing to Washington, but coming out with that massive win last week against Utah. They're going to go up against Cal this week. As we know, Bo Nix has been great all year, coming back into our Heisman rankings. And just not really too much to say about this team. They're still a high-powered offense. They're going to have a tough end to the season with Oregon State and USC. But if they can go out there and win out, get back into a Pac-12 championship, it would be great to see another rematch between them and Washington.
Absolutely. And I'll apologize to Oregon fans. I mean, I have them 7 as well, but I really don't have a lot to say after a big win against Utah, just because I think both of us expected them to do just that. I mean, Bo Nix looked incredible, as we've learned to expect this season. And Oregon, I mean, everyone in the country knows they're really, really good. They are a playoff level team. As you mentioned, it's just going to be a tough dynamic with Washington. If Washington falters, drops a game, Oregon is ready to come back and earn a playoff spot because they're going to earn it. They deserve to be a team that we're talking about as one of the best in the country. We've been doing it all year. I think that this team just checks all my boxes. That's a phrase I love to use, but if there's going to be a team that does it, it's the Ducks. They do a lot of things really well. Beating Utah is going to look good on their resume towards the end of the year, and that Washington loss is going to look bad. It's just how do you fill out the rest of it? I think the Ducks do that with a ton of wins, and hopefully we get towards the end of the season, and for Oregon fans, they have a pretty good argument to make the playoffs. A lot of that's to be determined for now. Ducks fans know you just got to keep winning, and it looks like they're on pace to do just that.
Yeah, and another team kind of in that same area, Texas right now coming off a big win against BYU. Overall, this team, like we know, has been very solid. Obviously, they lost earlier this season to Oklahoma. They're going to come out against Kansas State this week, another tough matchup. Kansas State ranked by the AP. I think they're kind of within that area. You can make an argument. I just think Oklahoma State, who beat them, it should be ranked instead of them. But Kansas State, on paper for the AP, this will be a ranked win for Texas. So a close game right now. The spread's 4, but this Kansas State team, I just don't think will be able to compete against this Texas offense, which has been very good. And Texas definitely getting close to that area of making the playoffs. They're going to go up against Oklahoma. I think I would pretty much bet on that they're going to go up against Oklahoma in a rematch for the Big 12 championship. So hopefully we do get another game between them, as the first game this year was very electric, came down to almost the last play of the game. So another great win for Texas, going to continue to roll here. And like I said earlier, kind of weird having them above Oklahoma, especially this big of a jump between 6 and 10. But this is one of those instances where that's just kind of how it happens, just because Oklahoma coming off of that loss where they shouldn't have lost that game.
Yeah, and the way that happens is with Texas continuing to play really well after an Oklahoma loss. They're not just winning games, they're winning games pretty convincingly. And that's what you need to do when you take an L early in the season, especially to a team in your division. I mean, at the end of the day, college football, or your conference, excuse me, but at the end of the day, college football has a lot of narratives. It is narrative driven, especially one, everyone's poll, I mean, is pretty much just as meaningful as everyone else's until we talk about the official playoff rankings. Really, the difference between the AP poll and our polls is that more people look at them. Doesn't make them any more valid. And what Texas has done to impress me is that they've kept winning and looking good on offense, even when Quinn Ewers out. I mean, that's one of the better quarterbacks in college football. This offense could have easily put up a stinker, put up 10 points. Instead, Malik Murphy comes out and plays a great brand of football, and Texas gets a good win over BYU, who is still a respectable team. That's how you keep it close. And even though Oklahoma has the head-to-head advantage, Texas just does look like the better team up in every game except for that one. Even in that game, they looked very, very good. So they earn respect points that way. Outside of that, just got to keep rolling. I know that's very basic college football talk, but at the end of the day, it's as simple as that. Texas, they control their destiny up until a hypothetical Big 12 championship game. If they look solid all the way there, definitely going to have a case for if they win that game they're in. If they start to falter, you don't really know what's going on with Ewers. It kind of takes longer than you expect. They could definitely fall. I mean, they have one of the higher ceiling and floor combinations out of anyone this high on the poll, but I really like Texas as well. I'm glad we can both agree they're in that 6th spot, and with potential to move up, I think Longhorn fans should be excited that Texas might actually be back. We'll have to wait and see, but this team isn't over yet.
Yeah, and another team kind of within that same area, just knocking outside of the top 4, is Florida State here. A team where they've had some good, solid wins towards the beginning of the season. Obviously, they beat Duke a few weeks ago, but it's one of those teams where I've had a really tough spot kind of ranking them each week because they are undefeated. They do have those ranked wins. They beat LSU earlier in the season. They just beat Duke, who was ranked, even though Riley Leonard got hurt. It's one of those teams where if they made the playoffs at this point and they go up against these teams like Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, Georgia, I just don't see them going out and winning any of those games. It just, I mean, it's not their fault necessarily. They're going to go out, and if they win the rest of these games, they'll definitely make the playoffs. That ACC championship game will be huge for them because if they lose that, then there's definitely some questions. If they lose against a team like Louisville at this point, if they play against them, it depends on where Louisville will be, but I wouldn't be surprised if the committee goes with a team. I mean, if you give a one-loss Alabama team against a one-loss Florida State team or an ACC one-loss Louisville team, we know who they're going to choose in the end. So I'm very interested to see how this Florida State team will compete for the rest of the year. They should go out and win all these games. I mean, they're going up against Pitt, Miami, North Alabama, and Florida. They should win all those pretty easily. I think that Florida matchup will be a little tough towards the end of the year, but this is one of those teams where it seems like every year there's one of those teams towards the end in the championship game that's highly ranked and just may get blown out towards the end of the year. When Notre Dame has been in the playoffs the past few years, whenever they make the playoffs, they get blown out in the first round. Not really a surprise at this point. So Florida State kind of in the area where I wouldn't be surprised if they get fraud checked towards the end of the season. I just haven't really seen that much from them. And I know that may be a hot take. There's a lot of people that think this Florida State team's really good. They have one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They have really good wide receivers, but it just seems like there's something that's a little off on this team for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. And I'm going to make the opposite case for the first time. I think we've been agreeing on Florida State a lot, but I'm actually bumping Washington down a spot into my fifth spot after a win. I mean, Michael Penix put up a masterclass. I don't expect anything less. He is playing like the best quarterback in college football, playing like the Heisman. The offense is incredible, but I can't keep letting Washington get away with playing these close games in the ACC against, or excuse me, the Pac-12 against lesser competition. But it just keeps happening week after week. And I know Washington beat Oregon head to head, which is the most impressive win out of pretty much any of these teams hanging around the top, maybe outside of Ohio State. That's an incredible win, and it helps out their resume. But when it comes to on the field production, Washington seems like they can't get their whole team to click all at once since that game. It's either their defense is faltering or the offense is going on a little slow. I know they play some kind of, sleepy late at night games out west in the Pac-12, but you still have to go out and show me that you are a playoff team week to week if I'm going to be impressed. And although Florida State, they have some factors that I'm not in love with either. It's definitely not my favorite team to have in a hypothetical playoff spot. They have been going out and blowing out the team I expect them to do, and they get head-to-head wins. I know Duke, it's a problem when Riley Leonard's hurt. It's not the same team, but they still go out and win that game pretty easily, while Washington struggles with teams that I don't expect them to. This Stanford game, it wasn't necessarily horrible. Very happy to see Michael Penix play at a high level, as I mentioned, but I can't keep giving Washington the nod if they're not going to go out and dominate when they should. And that's just what I've been seeing from Florida State on the stat sheets. I like Washington a lot. Definitely, this is a situation where I can see these teams flip-flopping for me. I know a lot of highly touted AP poll voters would hate to see teams go back and forth every week. But hey, at this point, these teams are so comparable. Whoever has the better win, I might just put them at 4 every week. That's really the case for this point. Very tough discussion here. I'll let you talk about Washington in your 4 spot, but very, very close for me.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree with you there. Going into next week, Washington going up against USC. So like you said, I mean, if they go out and win that game, I would assume that's a pretty impressive win overall, despite USC kind of being on the ropes. They're still one of the best teams in the country, and it should be a close game between these two teams. Like I said, they're going to be playing in USC at 3.5-point spread, but if Washington can go out there and win by a good amount, a very impressive win. Florida State going to be going up against Pitt. So, I mean, we've seen Pitt come out and win a game where no one really expected them to come out and win. So we could see them come out again and kind of knock off another ACC team. I doubt it, though. If Florida State loses this week against Pitt and Pitt beat Louisville and Florida State, we'll just put them in the top 5 at this point. We'll have the 3-6 Pitt team. But I expect them to come out and win. Florida and Washington, kind of both close teams overall. Like you said, I think Washington has just been very impressive for me. And like I said before, if they come out and beat USC this week, I think they kind of solidify themselves within the top four, especially going forward. But I wouldn't be surprised, like you said, kind of flip flopping each week between those two teams. I would say Washington, Florida State, and Texas, all very close. I think you could make an argument that one team could be above the other at that point. I know Texas kind of a little bit off just because of that Oklahoma loss, but outside of that, all three of these teams very close.
Yeah, and you could argue with Texas's big win against Alabama that maybe that's more impressive. There's definitely a bunch of ways to look at that. But with that being said, Florida State at 4, as I mentioned, I'm just a little bit more impressed with them up until this point, and we're seeing a complete team being built. I love to talk about Jordan Travis. I think he's really good, but with Keon Coleman, with other factors on that offense that have stepped up, good offensive line, good defensive line. The trenches are filled up well. Obviously, they've been recruiting pretty heavily in those areas. So it's nice to see some of those guys perform on the field at a high level. I'm just very impressed with Florida State. That being said, I will be the first one to tell you, if Washington goes out and beat USC and it's a good game, they handle it pretty easily, I'd be happy to put Washington in the 4th spot. It's definitely not I really have no bias with these two teams, no affiliation with either of them. Just want to see which team is playing better football. And that's definitely a resume booster for Washington. So I know it's tough when it's the top 4, and in the world of college football, only 4 teams make the playoffs. So it's definitely a hot take no matter who you have in those 4 spots. These two teams are 2 of the best teams in college football. When we get to the end of the season, if they're both undefeated, it's going to be really tough. And I do not envy the people that make the decisions at that point if things shake out similar to where we have them now. Don't think it's going to happen. Definitely could, though. So both of these teams very solid. I give Florida State the nod this week, but we'll have to see what happens the next time we come up here and talk about it.
Yeah, and then for the top 3, nothing really changes for me this week. Michigan at 3, they had the week off. They're going to be going up against Purdue this coming week. Hopefully they got their scouting done. We know by scouting that just means stealing all their signs. So we'll see what happens with them. Overall, I mean, this team, it's going to be interesting to see where they put them in the college football rankings, just because, like we've said before, that's a little different from the AP. And I know pretty much we've come out here every week and said the only reason why they're higher than Ohio State in the AP is just because of the preseason predictions and all these people that love JJ McCarthy. I think he's very good, but at the end of the day, I'm still waiting to see what happens with him towards the end of the year. We saw what happened at the end of the year last year when he went up against TCU. Through those 2 picks against them, they lost against TCU. As we know what happened with TCU in the championship game, did not fare very well for them. And I don't know. We've talked about this Michigan team every single week. They really haven't had any big games. So I can't really say much about them until they play Penn State and Ohio State towards the end of the year. And even Maryland, in between Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State, like you said before, we could easily see an instance where they go up against Maryland and they kind of take them for granted because they're looking forward towards that Ohio State game. And they could come out a little sloppy against Maryland just because they kind of push them aside and not really consider them a threat. But Maryland has been very good this year. So a big 3-game stretch towards the end of the year. I think if they can come out there and win those games, obviously they'll be one of the best teams in the country. If they beat Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State, I think pretty easily they're the number 1 seed overall, unless they lose in the Big Ten championship. That's a completely different story, though. But JJ McCarthy has a lot to prove for the rest of these weeks. He's going to have some tough matchups. Purdue right now, their last game on the cupcake schedule. And then after that, they finally play some real teams. So we'll see what happens towards the end of this year for Michigan. But we're really getting into the weeks where we're going to see if they're a real legit team.
Yeah, and I have Michigan at 3, and I'm excited for it. I'll be a little more positive than usual because we love to talk on here and make fun of Michigan. They are still a really, really good team. And JJ McCarthy, outside of the Bowling Green game, which I know is funny that it was against Bowling Green, outside of that, he's looked really, really solid. He deserves some of the hype that he gets. I'm not a fan of his personally, but not taking away from the game he plays, he is the perfect signal caller for this team. And when you compare him to a guy like Cade McNamara, who is doing it before, definitely a big talent gap there. So definitely some credit to give. The sign stealing stuff has definitely clouded up a lot of people's talks about Michigan. Right now, they're really just trying to stay competitive for the rest of the season. They go out there, they're going to beat Purdue pretty good. And then, as you mentioned, that 3-game stretch tells the story of their season. It's a little disappointing that we're going to be in a point where the college football official standings are going to be out and Michigan still hasn't played anyone. That definitely makes things a little convoluted, but they've done what they've had to do. They've came out on top of these games and they haven't really had a scare like a lot of these teams at the top have. They've handled business and they've stood on it. So I'll give Michigan their credit there. Looking forward to their season, when it actually picks up and becomes something that is going to be incredible to watch. I really want to see them playing a big game, but have to give credit where it's due. I still think they're one of the best teams in the country. They're going to hang in the 3 spot for me. If they go 3-0 against those teams, they're 100% going into the Big Ten championship as the number 1 team in the country. So definitely a storyline to look out for there. But I still do see a skill gap between Michigan and Ohio State and Georgia, who hang around in my top tier. We have them in different orders. So I'll let you talk about Ohio State first, but I still see a skill gap up until now.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that too. I mean, Ohio State has come out, it seems like every week. And Marvin Harrison, one of the best players in the country overall. I know I've seen a few people kind of coming off of him a little bit. I know there's been some speculation around him maybe not being this top 10 talent. And I completely disagree. I mean, this is one of the best receivers we've seen in a long time. I think people are just kind of upset now because now is kind of the point where people are really getting into the scouting and they see that Marvin Harrison may not be this 4-3 guy. He's one of the best route runners that we've seen in a long time. He's not this, he still is an athletic freak of nature that we've seen, but he's not like Calvin Johnson. Calvin Johnson was a completely different guy. This is just a guy that can go out there and run routes very good. And it's kind of the same thing that we saw from Justin Jefferson. I mean, Justin Jefferson, not entirely the fastest guy in the NFL, but he can go out there and run routes so well that it looks like he really is that fast. And Marvin Harrison, still one of the best players in college football. Kyle McCord has got it done when he needs to. And this Ohio State team is going to be going up against Rutgers this week. Usually you wouldn't look at a game against Rutgers as a big matchup, but it's an 18.5-point spread. I think Rutgers could definitely go out there and prove some trouble against them. Pretty much every team within the top 3, Michigan, Ohio State, and Georgia, have all had very slow first halves at times, especially Ohio State. They've had some games where they've been tied at halftime. It seems like almost every week. They end up pulling it out, though. Rutgers, a very tough matchup for them. Rutgers, though, like I've talked about, they're making their first bowl game since 2021. Before that, they made their first game since 2014. So definitely a program that's coming back right now, and they're getting a lot of in-state recruits, which have helped them out a lot. Ohio State, though, a big game for them this week. We'll see where they land in the college football rankings. I wouldn't be surprised if they're number 1 just because of those wins that they've had. And there's not really the AP bias that we've seen before with these college football rankings. So interesting thing to look out for there going into this first week. Obviously, they have their eyes set on Michigan at the end of the year. Really the only game that matters for them towards the end of the year. They should be able to go out there and win the rest of these games. So for now, just trying to cruise through the rest of this season for them. Rutgers, Michigan State, and Minnesota before Michigan. And obviously probably going to be the biggest matchup of the year when we get there.
Yeah, now I have Georgia at 2. I'll talk about Ohio State afterwards, but I mean, Georgia, they beat Florida by a pretty hefty score. They're still one of the best teams in the country. It's tough for me to put them 2 because I do think talent-wise, there's a very, very good argument that they're still the best team in the country. I just give Ohio State's resume the little bit of a nod that I think it deserves at the end of the day. Georgia, I think, has very good potential to build up that resume. I mean, they're going to get Missouri, who's going to be ranked. They're going to get Tennessee, who I really hope will be ranked, unless they drop a game to UConn or something. So that's going to be 2 more ranked SEC matchups. So, I mean, when we compare resumes afterwards, assuming Georgia finds their way on top of both of those games, very close. You could argue Ohio State would still probably have the best head-to-head matchup, but Georgia would have multiple SEC ranked wins, which you can't take lightly. So that's just kind of the big deciding factor for me right now. I think these teams are both incredible. I do give the nod to Ohio State just because of what we've seen from their, schedule. And a lot of that goes to how schedules are crafted. So depends how you look at it. With that being said, I'll hold no shame. I think Ohio State deserves to be the best team in the country. I think Georgia is right on their tail. This is another thing that could flip-flop. I know it's very hefty because we're talking about the best team in the country, but I think these guys are really close. I think assuming they don't have any big hits towards the end of their seasons, I think these are 2 teams that could be locks to make the college football playoff. 2 early for that, so we'll have to wait and see. But I don't think that would be the craziest take to say I think Georgia and Ohio State both make it. I think that's a lot of people's opinions up until this point. So looking forward to the end of both of these team seasons where they have some bigger matchups. But I'll give Georgia credit. I think Carson Beck could legitimately be a Heisman candidate, which is not something I was expecting to say. But you look at the numbers, he is one of the best players in college football, again, especially at the quarterback position, which the Heisman Trophy favors exponentially. So credit to Georgia. Bulldogs are a really good team. I'll give Ohio State the nod, but once again, very, very close.
Yeah, and on the opposite end, like you said, Georgia's starting off this stretch where I think if they go through, they're going up against Mizzou, who's close to the top 15 area in SEC matchup. They're going up against Ole Miss next week, who could be in the top 10, right around that area, 10 or 11 area, a massive win for them. And then they're going into Tennessee. After that, Tennessee probably going to be ranked at that point. I'd hope at least, unless, like you said, they lose a game to UConn. But three ranked SEC matchups. I think if you're a Georgia fan at this point, you shouldn't be too worried. Looking at this team overall, I know I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if they're around that 3 or 4, maybe even the 5 area for this first week of the college football rankings, just because they're probably going to have Ohio State and Michigan both up there, Florida State too. But if they go out here, they win against Mizzou, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. I mean, they're going to be back up there, the 1 or the 2 spot. I think Michigan or Ohio State will probably take that number 1 spot, whoever wins that game. I think that completely makes sense just because that'll be the biggest win out of any team throughout the whole year towards the end. I would be surprised if those aren't the number. I mean, between 1 and 3 seeds, both of those teams will be in the top 3. But Georgia has a chance to come out here. They beat Florida. They were unranked, but still a tougher game on paper. They beat Kentucky, really their only ranked matchup. But by the end of the year, if they come out and they run the table again, they'll have 4 SEC ranked matchup wins, some close to the top 15 or 10. So I think this is the start to build up their resume towards the end of the year. And with no hiccups, like you said, maybe not a complete lock at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if Georgia and Ohio State both go out there and get to the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And just to touch on Ohio State one last time, because I do have them ranked number 1, got to talk about them a little bit. They have a pretty easy Big Ten sweep coming up in the next 3 weeks, you would hope, with Rutgers, Michigan State, and Minnesota. Those are teams that they should handle well. That Wisconsin game, a little nerve-wracking, as you mentioned, halftime tied up, but they go out and win the game. They're just better than all those teams coming up. Obviously, the big narrative of their season is going to be that last week against Michigan and whatever the Big Ten championship game may entail. So a lot of things to be said there. I think up until this point, they've done everything right. Just to throw my hat into the ring on the Marvin Harrison Jr. thing, he's like the most complete wide receiver prospect we've seen in a long time. I don't care what the media says. It's a scouting fatigue thing. People watched him last year and thought he was incredible. People watched him this year and wanted him to be Jesus Christ on the football field. And realistically, I don't think we're going to find anyone like that. And, unless a real good prospect comes up through Tennessee soon, and I'll try to claim he's that guy, but we'll have to see it
Brock
happen.
Bowers.
Hey, Brock Bowers is close, but that injury definitely hurts his case a little bit. But regardless, Ohio State, an incredible football team. I think they're much deserving to be number 1. I know they're number 1 on a couple of people's lists up until this point. Definitely a good argument for them there. Excited to see what the Buckeyes do going forward. I think might be a little bit quiet on them coming forward, assuming they handle business against those 3 lesser Big Ten teams that I mentioned. But I think they deserve the credit, and really, really interesting to see where the college football poll puts them, because as we've mentioned, that's what matters at the end of the day. They could be as high as 1, or I could see a world where they're down to 4, or maybe they're the team hanging around at 5. A lot of possibilities there, but for me, they're my number 1, and they're going to stick here unless Georgia goes out and shows me something pretty significant coming soon.
Yeah, and like we kind of say every week, there's a lot of teams within that bottom 25 to 15 area that have big matchups pretty much every week. And like we said, Ohio State, Michigan kind of being able to cruise through some of these games for the rest of the season. Georgia going up against some tougher SEC matchups. They should be able to go out there and win those games. This week, like we mentioned before, a plethora of times, obviously Georgia and Mizzou, a big game. LSU and Alabama, probably the biggest game of the week. And then we also have Washington and USC. So some very big matchups in division, especially in the SEC this week. Definitely some teams to look out for. Arizona, potentially too, looking for that upset against UCLA, potentially getting onto our rankings with 3 losses, but probably the most impressive 3-loss team. And overall, with that being said, we'll see you guys next week with some rankings, and we'll have the college football rankings out too by then. So we'll have a lot of different areas where you guys can look. They'll have the AP college football and our rankings, so you guys can decide who's are the best in the end. I know a lot of people just say that whichever ranking has Notre Dame higher is the better one, but that's what it is.
At the end of the day, we got the best one. So check us out every week, and excited to see you guys for the next one. Peace out.